Good evening, friends. Good morning, actually, I should say. And shalom. Blessings to you all in the name of our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. Welcome to this episode of Un-Apologetics, the show where we are unapologetic about apologetics. And I am your host, CJ Cox. Want to go ahead and acknowledge those of you who are currently in the live chat. I see so far Janet Duttridge as well as Richard Neal. Thank you very much both for being here. Anybody else who is here, thank you as well. Obviously, do appreciate you. Those who are here, please remember to like and share this video. Please consider subscribing if you have not done so. Get notified of every time we go live by hitting that bell. And of course, get this out to all the different social media platforms which you frequent. What good is a message without an audience to hear it? Just a moment here. Sorry about that, friends. So while you're out sharing, of course, want to remind you to share this video to alternative social media platforms. Consider getting on these alternative social media platforms yourself. If you are one who uses Twitter or Facebook or YouTube or things of that nature, remember there all are, alternatives that will help you in fighting back against the big tech overlords, as I like to call them, as they consistently try to take away freedom of speech. You have an opportunity to do something about that. Use their competition if you're already using websites like it. And of course, while you're there, definitely consider sharing this video and following your boy. Excuse me. So I think that's all as far as that's concerned. Let's get to some of our channel housekeeping here for a moment. Want to remind you guys that on November the 22nd, we are going to be having a phenomenal conversation with Anthony Rogers. Anthony Rogers has been so gracious as to allow us to take some of his time so that we can have a conversation about sola fide, the Reformation. We'll probably bring up some of the fathers and stuff like that because that's been going. It's been a subject of interest over on his channel. But if you guys are interested in that, please do remember to go to that video, go to the thumbnail for that video, I should say. Like and share the thumbnail there, get the message out, hit the reminder so you get notified of when it's actually happening. And by the way, friends, there is a link in the live chat for you if you don't yet know about that video. Also, December the 9th, we do have a debate coming up on Standing for Truth's channel, our good brother Standing for Truth. He is going to be setting up a debate between me and Tested by Fire, and we're going to be talking about whether or not the Bible teaches Jesus as fully man, and fully God. I take the position that it does teach he is fully man and fully God. The gentleman who we are talking about now, Tested by Fire, right? He does not. So that's going to be hopefully a very interesting conversation over on Standing for Truth. Also, 9 days after that, on December the 18th, we will be over at, Myth Vision. Yes, Myth Vision. Going to be discussing the Exodus, whether or not it occurred. I am going to be taking the position it did, along with my good friend and brother, Anglican autodidact, Jonathan Sheffield. And we're going to be taking on Doctors Maggie Bryson and Josh Bowen, who, of course, will take the position that it did not happen. So that'll be super interesting. And then 9 days after that, we have another debate, and that one's going to be over on the Gospel Truth. We'll be with Sentinel Apologetics Rob Rowe, discussing whether or not the Bible allows for death before the fall. Excuse me, I had to grab a notebook here. I take the position it does not. He takes the position that it does, Rob. And excuse me, sorry, I have dogs here and such. But the point being that that'll be obviously a really fun conversation, and I hope that you guys are nice and excited for that one as well. Don't have anything else as far as announcements that I can share here today. There are a couple other things that are coming up here in the near future that hopefully will be incredibly cool, but we don't have those things set in stone quite yet, so I don't want to go about announcing them. But we are setting up more debates, we are setting up more interviews, and hopefully we'll be having more fun stuff to share with you guys here soon. Excuse me, I am tired. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get into our prayer for today so that we can get right into our topic for today. And if you guys would like to join me, I certainly would recommend you do so. Heavenly Father, I just want to thank you for everything you blessed us with here today, Lord. I want to thank you for the opportunity to study your word and to study with believers of like precious faith, Lord Jesus. I want to thank you for giving us an opportunity to explore these things in a free way, Lord, knowing that so many people across the world are not free to explore these kinds of things, Lord. So many people are not free to make their own decisions when it comes to ideas of consciousness, Lord. I just thank you so much that we live in a time and place where we do have that right. It's obviously a luxury we do not deserve, Lord. And I just want to make sure that we're always giving you grace for, or not giving you grace, Lord, giving you praise for that, as you are the one who gives us grace. And I just want to thank you tremendously for that, Lord. I ask for an anointing on me and the rest of the audience here today, Lord, that we may do only that which glorifies you and which causes your kingdom to be glorified, Lord, which causes your name to increase, that ours may decrease. I ask these things in Jesus Christ's holy name, and we give you the glory. Amen. All righty. So I'll go ahead and read a couple live chats here before we get right in. Richard Neal says, December is going to be a busy month for you, CJ. That's very true. And it might even be busier than it looks like so far. If I end up getting a couple more of these debates scheduled, I may end up doing something like 5 debates by the time December's done. We'll see. Obviously, it's in the hands of the Lord. But and then on top of that, I don't know when this is going to happen or even if it's going to happen. But I'm in talks with a quite popular rabbi at the moment, and I might have him on as soon as next week. But I might have him on as late as December. I don't want to give his name out yet because I don't want people to get too excited for something that's not set in stone. But the point is, things could be getting even a lot busier. So, thank the Lord for that, though, right? It's all good, busy. Richard Neal also says, I don't know of this dude, but his name looks Jewish. That is accurate, by the way. If Kahane is an alternative form of Cohen, then he is of Levi, and more importantly, of the house of Aaron. And that is also true. Kahane is a variation, a Ashkenazic variation of the Hebrew word Cohen, which means priest. Now, for those who don't know, and this will be a good segue into the episode, for those who don't know, the Levitical priesthood is alive and well today in 2021. It never died. It never went out of style, so to speak, right? Rather, what happened is the families, which were formerly associated with the Levitical priesthood, turned into rabbinical families and have been such for the last 2,000 years. If you've ever met somebody by the name of Cohen, Kahana, Kahan, Koch, or anything of that nature, you're actually speaking with someone who is a descendant of the tribe of Levi, potentially of the tribe of Aaron as well. It's hard for us to actually say because the word Cohen itself does refer to a priest general, whereas Rosh Cohen would be referring to your high priest. And the other reason that this is particularly important is because genetically we can prove that the peoples who share these last names, despite being from Ashkenazic or Sephardic or Mizrahi or other sorts of separate lineages to an extent, they all do have a shared lineage that goes back to a shared patriarchal ancestor. Now, of course, we already know that being readers of scripture. The question, though, is do they go back to Levi or do they go back to Aaron, who himself is, of course, also a descendant of Levi? The reason that is important, of course, is because while all Aaronites are descendants of Levi, not all Levites are descendants of Aaron. And it is only an Aaronite who can actually be the Rosh Kohen or the high priest not just any old run-of-the-mill Levite will do. But it is true that the Kahanas and Cohens and Cox of the world and all that other kinds of stuff, they are actually descendants of the Levitical priesthood, and the rabbi who we are going to be speaking of today is one of those descendants of the Levitical priesthood. And he lived like it. He very much lived like it. So let's, before we get in to the exact details of everything with his life, I want to go ahead and cause some controversy. So if you guys will excuse me a moment, I am going to turn my camera on here in a moment, and I'm going to cause a little bit of strife here. I just want to pre-warn you, but there's a reason for it. Please watch until the end. If you feel that I am causing too much strife, I think you will quickly see what the reason is, but just one moment. Okay, so as you guys can see, I'm not on my usual setup. Excuse me. I'm actually having to be out here because my dogs, not mom. I don't live with my mother, I promise. My wife is not currently here, so she is not able to watch these absolute spazzes, and so I have to stay out here with them. So I hope you guys appreciate that. So, what's the strife that I said I'm going to cause here? Well, number one, number two, I'm wearing some very highly offensive clothing right now. Why exactly have I decided to wear some incredibly highly offensive clothing? Well, because I think that the way that you likely feel, regardless of which way you feel, it could be positively or negatively towards this, the way that you likely feel right now is going to paint a very solid picture for you of how it is that we are to look at somebody like Rabbi Kahane. Okay. If there are those of you who see me wearing symbols of Zionism and symbols of a confederacy and think to yourselves, I don't understand. I thought that CJ was one who was strong for the rights of human beings. I thought that CJ was one who went out of his way to, for example, advocate for the Native American and the indigenous person in Australia and the Assyrian down in Iraq and all these other kinds of places. Why would he be wearing something that demonstrates to me a level of racism? And if you're on the other side of this, you may be thinking to yourself, wait a minute. I know CJ, and I know all these different things that I've already listed out. So despite the historical context that comes with these labels, completely disregard that because I know CJ, right? And both of you, if you have either of those reactions, have a fair reaction. You have a fair reaction to consider it odd. You have a fair reaction to be a little judgmental. If you see something that I am currently donning that is associated with potentially persecuting, maybe even those you're related to, if you're one of African American descent, right? Or Palestinian descent in the case of the hat. And yet at the same time, you're also justified in saying, wait a minute, I know this person. Wait a minute, I know there has to be something here, even though you're now disregarding the historical context that is besides those symbols. And you notice how complicated of an issue that now becomes, right? Because it means for me something different than it means for you, regardless of what it means for you, right? It could mean Southern heritage. It could mean racism. It could mean preservation of history. It could mean my association as a conservative political believer. Regardless, the thing is you don't know, and it's loaded, and it has an awful lot of baggage with it, even if it does mean something different to me. Same thing with the hat. Same thing with the hat. Is this a symbol of the Jewish people, or is it a symbol of a religion which denies Christ? Is this a symbol of a people's return to their homeland, or is this a symbol of a people's oppression of another? And you can't escape those questions when it comes to these kinds of symbols, right? And you can't escape those questions when it comes to individuals and when it comes to certain ideologies and when it comes to certain political parties and so on and so forth. And if that is something that you're now actively dealing with in your mind, having heard me say these things, having seen these symbols I've decided to don, hold on to that, because that question of how do we see these things is going to paint this entire episode for you. That question of how do I jive the positive of how certain people see this with the negative of how certain people see this, knowing both are equally valid and true, how do I jive those together? Right? Excuse me. Really quickly, I see Richard Neal says, I hope it is Zev Porat. It is not actually. The rabbi I'm considering having on is actually a non-believer, so we will be having a discussion if he is on here as far as a dispute, right? But you know what? I might as well just say it's Rabbi Asher Meza. Rabbi Asher Meza, for those of you who may not know. He's a Jewish rabbi who's very popular for his position that a Jew should evangelize to the Gentile, which I actually have a lot of respect for personally, because if I was following the Jewish religion, I would certainly want Gentiles to join in the covenant. But nonetheless, just to leave some of the suspense. I don't know for a fact that he's going to be on, but we have each other's phone numbers. We are talking, and it does appear he's interested. So that being said, though, Richard Neal, now that you put it in my head, Zepora would be a very interesting person to have on here. News Unit is here. Shalom, thank you for being here. He says this is all part of Trump Judeo-Christian MAGA Church, and soon our King Trump, King Cyrus, and King David will rule and reign in the USA, which is spiritual Israel. Now, I have disagreement with that. I don't know if you're being serious or not. I assume you are, because I didn't have any hint of trolling there. But if you were telling a joke or something like that, definitely let me know. I don't agree with that. However, News Unit, you'll be excited to know that your comment is going to actually come into play later on in this conversation, right? But nonetheless, want to get back to the point. Want to remind you guys, okay? Why do I don these highly offensive symbols here today? Because I want you to consider the way it is that you feel by knee-jerk reaction when you see these symbols. Do you immediately, hey, I support Israel? Or do you, that's a symbol of one who is against Christ? Do you immediately, hey, I'm a supporter of the preservation of history. Hey, I'm from the South. I have Southern heritage, that kind of stuff. Or do you, that was a symbol of racism? And knowing that both of those have historical precedent, and knowing that both of those are equally valid, because they are equally valid. And of course, I own this clothing, right? So I'm not saying that I think these symbols are inherently evil or anything like that, right? But they are equally valid. And you need to consider why they are equally valid and why this is something that people have such a hard knee-jerk reaction to, because it's going to paint the entire episode that we have here today. One of the things I want you guys to ask yourselves, if you do disagree with my choice here today, is do you feel differently now than you did 18 minutes ago? I had to look at how long I've been on. Do you feel differently now about CJ Cox than you did 18 minutes ago? If you do, I'm not judging you. But know, once again, that feeling is going to be something that will very, very obviously paint the picture, and you're going to see exactly what I mean of how we look at somebody like Rav Meir Kahane. So let's get some screen share. We're going to read a little bit of Wikipedia. I understand that Wikipedia is just a general source. However, it is good for us to get some brief biography on the good rabbi here today. So while I'm pulling that up, let me give you guys some details, okay? Excuse me. Give you guys some details as to this. So I am ethnically Jewish, okay? I am descendant of Jews, specifically, not one who ever had religious Judaism in his life. Now, that is important for the purposes of this conversation, because growing up, I was quite fond of the person we're going to talk about today, Rabbi Meir Kahane. And he has been incredibly influential in my own life as far as how I see not only my political ideology, and as far as how I see not only my philosophy and my way at my way of, looking at life. But also, he has been highly influential on the way that I see Israel. He has been highly influential on the way that I see politics general. He has been highly influential on the way that I see the way the world going. And he's even been highly influential in aspects of my faith, despite the fact that he denies our Messiah, or denied, I should say. He was murdered in 1990. Now, Meir Kahane is essentially like your Malcolm X for the Jewish people, right? For those who are familiar with the American civil rights movement, you'll know that popularly there tends to be the two sides. There's the Martin Luther King Jr. side, which was peaceful, which was nonviolent, which wanted to demonstrate in a way that was disobedient, breaking the law, but which was not actually harming anybody or harming anybody's property. And on the other side, there was Malcolm X, otherwise known as Malik al-Shabazz, who was much more violent and aggressive with his rhetoric, who came to these meetings saying things like, "No, you are better than the white man. No, you are good and awesome people, and you have pride in your blackness. And who cares if you're separated, as long as you are strong, as long as your families are prosperous." All these other kinds of things, right? And people tend to see the civil rights movement through the lens of you're either going through the Martin Luther King kind of way, where you're being peaceful, being civilly disobedient, but not being aggressive, where you are one who wants integration and stuff like that. And the other side, the flip side, the Malcolm X side, the Nation of Islam, Louis Farrakhan kind of side, the let's go back to Africa, Marcus Garvey kind of side, the let's make sure we're aggressive because we're better than the white man kind of side, right? And these are two very distinguished positions here in the American civil rights movement, right? Meir Kahane is like the Malcolm X version of that, but for the Jewish people. Okay. He was born in 1932, August 1st, in New York City, to a very highly revisionist Zionist family. What is revisionist Zionism? Well, revisionist Zionism is just a fancy way of saying right-wing Zionism. It is a Zionism that is openly nationalistic. It is a Zionism that is openly hostile towards non-Jews in the land of Israel, provided that those non-Jews are, of course, against the state of Israel. So in other words, it's not xenophobic, but it's a lot like a American conservatives position of, hey, if you want to live here, you need to assimilate, that kind of thing, right? And it was founded by a famous Jew by the name of Zev Jabotinsky, who also was a founder of numerous different youth groups and political parties and stuff like that, which Meir Kahane actually ended up growing up associated with. He was a member of Zev Jabotinsky's Batar movement, right? I think I'm saying that right, Batar, which was a youth group dedicated to training young Jews to fight for Israel when eventually, because 1948 had not yet happened, they would go to Israel to retake their land in the name of Zionism, right? Kahane's family was also personal friends with this man I just mentioned, Jabotinsky, right? As well as other, what shall we say, radical Zionists. And in fact, they would very often come into his house, Kahane's house, right? Speaking with his father and people who were friends with his father about issues related to Zionism. His father, a guy by the name of Yehazkel, which is Ezekiel, in case you're curious, Yehazkel Kahane, was born in 1905 and was actually the son of a man who had made Aliyah in the 1870s. Aliyah, for those who don't know, is the immigration of Jewish people back to the land of Israel. And if I remember correctly, I believe that Yehazkel himself was actually born in the land of Israel, right? Eventually, he had to flee due to persecutions in World War I. Long story short, after bouncing around, he ends up here in the United States. And here in the United States, August 1st, 1932, is born to him a son, Meir Kahane, whose birth name is actually Martin David. And again, Meir grows up in this household. His father is a rabbi, or at least a religious Jew. And so he's growing up in this household of radical Zionism, radical right-wing Zionism, actually meeting the figureheads of the right wing of Zionism very often, right? But also growing up in a deeply religious home. Excuse me. Now, a huge portion of what would paint his early life is the fact that when he was a young boy of 9 years old, 10 years old, if you want to get to the fact that, obviously we were attacked very late in 1941. And so by the time he's actually, aware of things going on, he's going to be in the 10th year of his life. But a big moment for the rabbi during his formative years was listening to the radio in New York City every time that bombers would go over and take out, different, military sites in France and Germany and all these other kinds of places. Some of you might be wondering, France, where you got to remember the German government actually took over a lot of stuff early in the war. Not the point, though, right? And watching those video, or not watching those videos, excuse me, listening to those radio shows, put in young Meir's mind two very important things that would end up painting the rest of his life in these colors, so to speak, right? The first was the sheer brutality that Allied soldiers actually utilized against the Axis powers, right? Meir Kahane was struck by the fact that nobody bats an eye when you firebomb Dresden. Nobody bats an eye when you raze Berlin to the ground, R-A-Z-E, right? Nobody bats an eye when you storm Okinawa and Iwo Jima, and some don't even bat an eye when you go as far as to drop nuclear bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And what is the point here? Well, there are certain times when violence is not only necessary, but so necessary that people don't dare to question it. And that was a huge moment for Rabbi Kahane. Should address him by his title, right? The other thing that was incredibly important about this is what everybody ended up figuring out later on. And one of the things that's unfortunate, being a Jew at that time, is you would have to figure it out before everybody else, or at least acknowledge it before everybody else. Of course, I am talking about the Shoah, the Holocaust, right? And contrary to popular belief, though the United States government was not astutely aware of what was going on, and though it is true that United States soldiers were certainly not aware of what was going on until they actually stumbled upon the camps, it is not true, it is a modern historical myth that the Allied powers were unaware that a Holocaust was happening, until their unaware boys stumbled across, after D-Day, these concentration camps. That's not true. That's not true. There are writings from back in 1942 from rabbis and Catholic priests and pastors and things of that nature saying, help us preserve these people. In the case of some of these rabbis, hey, we got people knocking at our door looking for Jews, and we want to find them, or excuse me, want to help them, rather. We have them hiding underneath the floorboards in our church. We have them hiding up in the attic where Anne Frank is, all that kind of stuff. Will you please come and help us? And nobody did a damn thing. That is a historical fact, my friends. There were writings that Catholic priests, bless their souls, sent to the Vatican, sent to the College of Cardinals, sent to Pope Francis himself, saying, we have Jews under the floorboards. There are Nazis trying to get them. Please send help. As early as 1942, and nobody did a damn thing. Nobody did a damn thing. There were rabbis in 1943 who were sending messages to American rabbis saying, go to Roosevelt and have him bomb the rail lines so that Jews will not be taken to concentration camps, to these death camps, to these Auschwitzes, and exterminated at the rate of what eventually would turn out to be 6 million in a short 3-year period. And they did nothing. Nothing at all. They didn't even let their boys know, so that by the time our soldiers, our American soldiers, were actually walking through these fields, by the time they were conquering Germany and getting rid of the vile and disgusting threat that is Nazism, they were unaware entirely of what their Jewish brothers and sisters in humanity were actually going through. And they would stumble upon these places, these concentration camps, where they would see people who practically did not look human anymore because of the tortures that they were going through, right? And they were completely unaware of this, despite the fact that their commanding officers were fully aware and did nothing. And that was a huge moment for Rabbi Kahane, because it caused him to understand a thing that I think it would behoove all of us to understand as well, which is people only care for the people that they care about. But the idea that human beings are out here to be everyone's allies, it's just simply not true. It's just simply not true. If you care about black rights, and there's no reason you shouldn't, I care about black rights, right? But unless you are a particularly good person, unless you are a saint, you probably don't have that extending to Native American rights, or to Jewish rights, or to the rights of the Karaite Jew in Israel or to the rights of the Aborigine in Australia. You only care about the things which you care about. And there's nothing necessarily wrong with that. I'm not judging you. I'm not blaming you. But the point is, now when Rabbi Kahane is growing up, you can see why it's such a big deal for him to say, hey, no, Jews take care of Jews. And this was a huge moment in his early life, in his formative years. Eventually, he goes to rabbinical school, right, as of course he would have to in order to be a rabbi. He does become a ordained rabbi. I believe he got a law degree as high as a master's. It might have been a bachelor's, but I believe it was as high as a master's, though he would eventually be disbarred and was not actually a practicing lawyer for any point in time. And he actually had a pretty interesting stint as a informant for the FBI. He was a member of the John Birch Society, or at least was to infiltrate the John Birch Society. And so they asked him to be an informant, and he was for a short period of time there in the 1950s. He became a head rabbi at a excuse me, at a Brooklyn synagogue in 1956. And when he was there, he started to teach specifically the youth, because he wanted to get people to start being stronger Jews, right? About these ideas of Jewish pride and, you only have friends for a moment and all these other kinds of things. But he also was adding on top of that, excuse me, a new element, which we have not yet talked about, which was he was firmly a believer in the ideas of Torah Judaism, right? And when he would go to these Jewish people, these Jewish youths, he would ask them questions like, why be Jewish? Why be Jewish at all, right? Why on earth would you not go marry a Gentile woman if she's beautiful and you love her? Why on earth do you not eat bacon? Why do you go to synagogue on Shabbat? What's the point of celebrating Purim? So on and so forth, right? And he would ask people these questions. What exactly is the point of being Jewish? And then, of course, he would explain after that, this is the point of being Jewish. We are the Lord's chosen people. We have a Torah. This Torah comes down from God at Mount Sinai to our prophet Moshe. And, of course, that is, in the end, the reason to be Jewish. A Jewish man whose young daughter comes home with a Gentile boy, and he says, no, I disapprove. But he doesn't have an actual reason behind that. That man is a racist. But a Jewish man whose daughter comes home with a Gentile boy, and he says to her, no, we're Jews. We follow the God of Israel. Not just because we're Jews, but because he is the God of Israel. Because we have a real Torah from a living God, right? Because we are the chosen covenant people. That man is not a racist. That man is nothing more than a good Jew, right? And of course, we as Christians can understand that sort of thing. If one of our daughters were to come home with an Arab man, and we had a problem with it because he was Arab, that would be racist. But if one of our daughters were to come home with a Muslim man, and we had a problem because he was Muslim, we had a problem because we're Christians, and we want our Christian daughters to marry Christian men and grow up and have Christian families and raise Christian children who themselves will have Christian children, and so on and so forth. That's obviously not racism. That's different. And he would try to explain these things because in his mind, Judaism had become racist. Judaism had become, we're Jews because we're Jews, not we're Jews because we have a Torah. And so he would try to explain to people, this is the Torah, this is the way, this is how you go about following the God Yehovah of Israel, right? And that ended up making a lot of people very angry. He gets fired from this synagogue because he started to teach the youth about true, authentic Torah Judaism, not any of this nonsense that you see in the modern Western world of nominal Judaism, right? And they did not approve. They thought that he was turning the youth against their own family members, right? And so he's eventually fired, but he gets a good deal of popularity about it because he publishes in a newspaper a little opinion piece he's able to write where he says, my career was martyred for bringing true religion to a dead synagogue, right? And of course, that was largely true. But now you can see all these different things that are starting to build up in him, right? This sense of Jewish national pride, this sense of understanding people as interests rather than allies, this sense of the Jews will always be fighting for the Jews. We need to have strong Jewish pride, all that kind of stuff. going back to Israel, being Zionist, and of course adding this Toraic Judaism. Well, and I'm skipping over a bunch of stuff, right, because we only have an hour. Fast forward to the age of 36, 1968. Meir Kahane forms a group known as the Jewish Defense League. Okay. And the Jewish Defense League's entire goal is, hey, there's rampant anti-Semitism in the first world. Really, there's rampant anti-Semitism everywhere, right? That's one of the unfortunate consequences of being God's people, is everybody kind of hates you. There's a lot of blessings that come with being God's people. Absolutely. There's a lot of, shall we say, not blessings, not so good things that come with being God's people. And one of them is the fact that every other group of people, for some reason, has decided that they hate your guts, right? And so we formed this Jewish Defense League. The goal of them being, we will combat literally, physically, violently, aggressively, anti-Semitism where we find it. And so they would go train Jewish youth in karate. They would train Jewish youth in how to use firearms. They would go out and actually commit acts of terrorism. But we'll get to those in a minute. But you have to understand these acts of terrorism are they're unique. They're things that you have to consider in their context, right? Richard Neal says, I remember them in the news in NYC. You probably do. You probably do, especially if you, I don't know how old you are, Mr. Neal, but if you remember the 70s, if any of you guys were alive in the 70s and conscientious in the 70s, then you may remember a lot of what the JDL actually did, because, and now let's go ahead and explain some of those acts of terrorism that I was talking about. They would go out and they would actually attack people as a means of combating anti-Semitism and for the rights of Jews. Why exactly? Well, because at the time, there was a problem where the Soviet Union was not letting people leave the country, right? Richard Neal says, I am 65. So you probably remember exactly what I'm talking about then. That's kind of cool, right? But nonetheless, excuse me. So in the 1960s and the 1970s, the Soviet Union was not letting people leave. That, of course, includes Jews. Now, the Jews, being religious people, were also being persecuted by the Soviet Union. And on top of that, the communist Soviet Union was quite anti-Semitic anyway. So on top of being anti-religious, they're also just anti-Semitic, right, on the other end. And so the Jews are not able to leave to go to Israel, but they're not able to actually live a peaceful life where they are either. And so Meir Kahane, wanting to fight back against this, seeing that every issue gets first page news except issues that pertain to the Jews, right? In other words, if we got something going on in Kent State, you're going to hear about it. And if we got something going on in Vietnam, you're going to hear about it. And if there's a march on Selma, you're going to hear about it. And it's not that you shouldn't hear of those things, but nobody seems to want to talk about this Soviet Jewish problem. And so Meir Kahane decided, I'm going to make people talk about this Soviet Jewish problem. And so he started with the JDL committing acts of what we can only define as terrorism, but which also, if understood in their proper context, are clearly freedom fighting. And this is why I say earlier, right, the knee-jerk reaction you have about the symbols I'm wearing, you can see why it becomes important to really examine that knee-jerk reaction, really examine the way you feel about these things, because though things in general are black and white, people certainly are not. And so some of the acts of terrorism that they would go ahead and commit is, for example, Meir Kahane personally, as well as a couple other members, of JDL, once locked a Russian ambassador in a phone booth and beat him to a pulp. They then called the police and said, hey, guess what? The Russian ambassador is sitting in a phone booth beaten to a pulp. You might want to do something about that. And of course, the Soviet ambassador is attacked in the United States, and people are going to the JDL saying, hey, you're going to cause a war potentially. You're causing strife between the Soviet Union and the USA, all this other kind of stuff. And he looks at them in the eye and says, that's exactly what I aim to do. Now, are you going to do something about it? And it got even worse than that. He actually, the JDL bombed an embassy at one point in time. Meir Kahane was even arrested at one point in time for attempting to bomb a dance, like a ball kind of thing, where there was going to be very many Soviet generals and Soviet officials here in the United States. He ended up getting arrested, serving a year in prison for that. And eventually, and there's other acts, again, I'm very, very much oversimplifying a lot of this, right? And eventually, he has all these different acts being committed. People are starting to get popular. The JDL's in the news. Meir Kahane's in the news. And the Soviets listen. And the Soviets listened. And by 1971, you went from on average 0 to on average 85 Jews a day being able to leave. Huge number? No. But it's Jews being able to leave, Jews being able to go to freedom, right? Eventually, by the end of the 1970s, by way of Kahane's tactics, 50,000 Jewish people were freed from the yoke of Soviet communism and found themselves in a country for their own ethnos in the land of Israel. You can see, I'm sure, why this is such a non-black and white issue to look at, right? Did he commit acts of terrorism? Yes. Was there solutions that helped the Jewish people? Absolutely. It's not, unfortunately, that easy of a thing. But eventually he made Aliyah, goes to Israel, right? He decides he wants to be a politician in Israel. Why? Well, because he has a lot of ideas. And these ideas are ideas which are harsh, which are cruel, which are Torah Judaism. And that's one of the things that, once again, is going to make this an incredibly interesting thing to look at. The modern Jewish nationalist movement, whether they acknowledge it or not, some do and some don't, is based in the ideas of 1970s and 1980s Kahanism. And those ideas are based in what can only be described as a proper understanding of Torah Judaism, but that proper understanding of Torah Judaism without the context of the Christian New Testament is going to cause conflicts with what we believe. You guys are going to see that very plainly. So what were some of the things which Meir Kahane wished to do? Well, first off, let's go to mentioning his party. It was known as the Kahane Party. Okay. That's going to be spelt K-A-C-H in the English. If you see my thumbnail, you can see how it's spelt in the Hebrew, Kaf. The longer letter is also a Kaf, but a final Kaf is actually different than the regular Kaf, but nonetheless. So, this party known as the Kahane Party, it is currently banned in the state of Israel because the state of Israel is not actually democratic in the same way our own nation is. And they have considered the movement to be racist, right? But some of the ideology here that, I forgot to click there, sorry. Some of the ideology here that the Kahane Party would decide to put forward is ideology that you have definitely heard before because it's quite popular in the modern day. Let's start right here with the subject of Arabs or just non-Jews in general. The Kahane Party suggested that every Arab inside Israel was to be offered the right of residence as a non-citizen or a resident stranger, as the scripture puts it. All non-Jews will have total personal rights and no national ones. What does that mean? That means that Kahane was suggesting that you would have your right to freedom of religion, your right to freedom of the press, your right to trial by jury, even your right to things like self-defense and things like that, right? But you would not have a right to run for a political office, for example, or vote in national elections, for example, or things that would be considered citizens' rights. To give an example that may, or to give, an example is the right word. For Americans, right, we often have the conversation about whether or not illegal immigrants should vote in this country. And the idea from the conservative side of that argument is that is a national right. It is not a human right, right? And so you only get your national rights if you are a citizen of the United States of America. Well, it's a similar thing that's being presented here, only rather than saying you only get your national rights if you are a citizen of Israel, he is taking it farther and saying you only get your national rights if you are an ethnic Jew. Now, I understand that that's something that may be a little odd for an American to hear, being that we live in a country that is civically nationalist, meaning if you are born here, you are an American. And that's 100% a good thing. I very much am a patriot. I love civic nationalism. I love that unique factor about the United States. But it is a unique factor. In most other countries across the world, these countries are specifically states for a nation, states for an ethnos. What's a nation? What's an ethnos? It's a group of people, right? So, for example, the Irish state, Ireland, is for the Irish people. It's not for me. I'm not Irish. The Swedish state is for the Swedish people. The Japanese state is for the Japanese people. And that's the way most countries in the world operate. You have a certain people who are from a certain area, and they form a state around their ethnos, because it is commonly been understood by most political philosophers that the ethnos is not truly free unless they have a homeland and are, in fact, sovereign in their homeland. I'm not going to get into political philosophy today, but the point just kind of being, if it sounds odd to you to hear that a state would be specifically for a certain ethnic group, you have to understand that your country is unique, not the other way around. Most countries have this idea that this is a state specifically for the group of people who live here. And again, we could go on and on and on and on and on, giving the examples of that. Sweden, France, Ireland, Italy, Greece, so on and so forth. That was all just a bunch of European countries, but Russia, India, Saudi Arabia, you can continue. Those who refuse the offer, meaning the offer to have personal rights and no national ones, and agree to leave quickly and peacefully, will receive compensation for their property with 10% taken off and placed in a special fund for Sephardic Jews who left property behind in Arab countries and were never compensated. It's important to note really quick, this is just a small point of correction, but it says Sephardic Jews here. Sephardic Jews are actually from Spain. Some of them are also from Morocco and areas like that, so a lot of them do know Muslim countries, or do come from Muslim countries rather. But for the most part, what was actually being referred to by Kahane here is actually what's known as Mizrahi Jews or Middle Eastern Jews, but nonetheless. Until then, every Israeli Arab from the age of 18 will serve 3 years of manual labor plus yearly manual duty as part of the reserves. Before you run too far into that thinking that's some kind of a form of slavery or something like that, know that in the state of Israel, every citizen has to serve at least 2 to 3 years, depending on your gender, 3 years for men, 2 for women, in the military, right? So this isn't a unique thing here. And once again, that's another thing it's unique for us to not have this kind of thing. In most countries, you are able to be, and in fact, even in this one, we do have a military draft. It's just not something that's commonly utilized. You do have a right to conscript the populace, conscript the citizenry, for the purposes of not only military endeavor, but also building and things of that nature. So, once again, just want to briefly explain that some of these things can sound worse than they actually are, simply because of the fact that we are Americans and are not used to this kind of world. Excuse me. The National Insurance Institute, which pays monthly checks for every Arab child under the age of 18, will be transferred to the Jewish agency and made with payments made only to Jews. This is actually something that I think a lot of us can sympathize with, as we live in a country currently where a lot of United States citizens seem to have been forgotten, right? Meanwhile, a lot of refugees, illegal immigrants, and even people completely outside of the borders of our country seem to be getting tons and tons and tons and tons of our taxpayer dollars. Well, obviously, once again, understanding Judaism, or not Judaism, Israel is a Jewish state, so it has a little bit of an ethnic difference. It's not civically nationalist like we are. That's the same general idea which Kahane was deciding to pass around here. Next point here, an automatic death penalty shall be enforced for every Arab terrorist caught. And you can see the extreme brutality that we actually see from Rabbi Kahane here. But again, it's important for us to note that this is simply Torah Judaism. You may be wondering to yourself, how exactly does this jive with Torah Judaism? Well, for example, when it comes to the resident stranger, go and read the book of Leviticus. It is true that the resident stranger, the foreigner in this land, is not to be abhorred and is to have the same laws in regards to them as in regards to the native born. That is what Kahane talks about when he says they have all their personal rights, they have all their human liberties within the state of Israel. But it was always understood that they were outside of the covenant people. They are resident strangers. And there are certain laws in the Bible, for example, laws that pertain to servitude, that are actually different, that are unique, that are exceptions to what God has laid out as far as not having any difference betwixt the two. That is straight up Torah Judaism, my friends, to say that such and such a people, because they are Jewish, do have certain rights here, and such a people, because they aren't Jewish, do not. Go ahead and read Exodus 21, Leviticus 25. if you need some examples of that. Also, the idea of killing one's enemy without mercy within the land comes specifically from Deuteronomy, specifically Deuteronomy chapter 21, which talks about war laws, right? And it says when you go to a city outside of the land, you do take prisoners and all this other sorts of stuff. But when you go to a city inside of the land, you are to fight without mercy. And again, Kahane was doing nothing more than saying, this is what the Torah says. I am a believer in the Torah. And by the way, friends, I'm going to get to some of this at the end because we're Christians, right? We don't just simply take the Torah. But you do have to understand, when we're talking about this is brutal, this is aggressive, this is nationalistic, all this other kind of stuff, this is simply Torah Judaism. This is simply Torah Judaism. Economy and employment. A 5-day week of work will be introduced throughout the country, with Shabbat and Sunday being full days of rest. Sunday will be a day of freedom and entertainment, sport and general pleasure, while the Shabbat will be a day of spiritual rest with no public desecration of the day. Once again, you see simple Torah Judaism. Remember the Sabbath, keep it holy. A free economy will be put into force with regulations and licenses cut to a minimum and the bureaucracy cut to the bone. You may not actually know this, but modern Israel was founded by a socialist party. David Ben-Gurion was a socialist. In fact, even to a certain extent, Theodor Herzl, the founder of Zionism, was a socialist. And when somebody like Kahane comes up and says, we're going to put a free economy into force, it's not like when somebody says that in the United States. When Ron Paul, for example, says we need to get a free economy into force, he's saying, hey, we have a free economy that people are violating the rules of. Let's get back to having a properly functioning one. Kahane is saying, hey, I was born in the United States and the economy there works really well. Let's quit with the socialist crap, right? And so you can see how big of a deal this actually was when he said it. Worker participation in factories will be encouraged. This is a big deal. Why? Because there is an idea, not just in Israel, but also here in the United States, that work is somehow beneath us. How many times have you heard somebody say, oh, I'll go and get a job when I find one that doesn't suck, or they may have some kind of a curse word associated with that, right? When I find one that's not crappy, something like that. Everybody has the dream job, and anything less than the dream job is something that is not worth their time. Of course, that's not how reality works. In reality, you need people to cook, you need people to clean, you need people to clean sewers. And what is he saying here? Worker participation in factories is to be encouraged. Labor is good. Labor is a good thing. This is not only Torah Judaism, this is New Testament Christianity. He who does not work shall not eat, Paul says. He who does not work shall not eat. That's in your scriptures, your Christian scriptures, by the way. Not kidding. Also, he who does not provide for the members of his own family, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. That's Paul speaking. So we see here that this encouragement of labor is not only something that is an example of Torah Judaism, and is not only something that is desperately needed to be communicated to the Jewish people, but it's also a big part of Christianity, and it desperately needs to be communicated to the West here as well. We also have gotten to a point where we have decided that labor is somehow beneath us, that servitude is somehow beneath us, and as a result, our economy is filled with nothing but lazy, gluttonous scum, in my opinion. And I say that with respect. I don't call people scum because I hate them or because I want to degrade them, but because I would like them to understand what you are doing in not providing for your family, in not working to build up your community, in not going and being a laborious member of society, is you are behaving like a scumbag. You are even denying the faith if you are a Christian. But let's continue. The Histadrut will be limited to, I don't know if I pronounced that right, will be limited to being a union only and will have to sell off its holdings. Only free enterprise that brings in foreign investment and that encourages domestic capitalism and incentive will allow Israel to escape its position as a beggar basket case. You notice he calls it a beggar basket case. Why? Well, because it may shock you to know that Israeli nationalists actually agree with anti-Zionists here in America in one thing, and that is that Israel should not be taking billions of dollars from the United States every year. Now, of course, Those in the states who don't want Israel to get foreign aid think of it from the perspective of, hey, we're giving a bunch of money out of, that we don't have, our taxpayer money, to a country that doesn't need it, right? But those in Israel, what they see, and the reason that they don't actually like this, is because imagine, if you will, that you're trying to get on your feet, and every time you're trying to get on your feet, you have people who care for you genuinely, who love you tremendously, who are constantly making your way a little easier. Hey, I'll go ahead and take care of your bills. Hey, I'll go ahead and make sure you're fed. Don't worry about getting a job because I'll make sure you're well taken care of. Do you think eventually you might get lazy? Do you think eventually you might begin to act like a beggar? Do you think eventually you might begin to act like a 30-year-old man in his mother's basement playing Call of Duty video games? You might. You might. And guess what, friends? That thing has happened to the state of Israel. Israel is a beggar state. Israel is a state that is currently incapable of functioning on its own. Why? Because we have created a druggie out of the state of Israel, which absolutely needs its annual fix of billions of dollars every year, and they're incapable of operating on their own. That's a problem. Every nation should be capable of operating on its own, even if it means that its allies stop helping it at that moment. I'm not saying we shouldn't be allies with Israel. I obviously am very Zionist, right? But the point being, a proper understanding of Zionism shows you this is not a good thing. Minimum wages, and this is one we won't go too deep into because it's not important. Minimum wages raised to high levels. Underemployment, obviously I disagree with that, but nonetheless, underemployment compensation limited only to those who are incapable of working or can prove they have not been able to find work, and Jewish labor will be advocated, which is the same thing as that worker participation in factories being encouraged. Huge amounts, of budgetary funds that go to the Arab sector will be diverted to the needs of Jewish underprivileged and the urban neighborhoods and towns. Israel first, right? Israel first. Education. A total reorganization of Jewish education in Israel shall be undertaken, including schools, the army, and the state news media. All schools in Israel will be given a basic curriculum in Judaism and Jewish national pride. Parents who do not wish this can organize their own private schools, but will not receive government funding. Once again, simple Torah Judaism here. You educate people in Judaism because that's what makes you Jewish. That's what separates you from the other people, what makes you a peculiar people, right? The Aliyah Department, Foreign Affairs, the Aliyah Department shall be reorganized with all emissaries recalled and a new system implemented under which a shaliach, or emissary, sent to a foreign country will be one who himself came from this country. Why is this important? Well, because Kahane was very much a fan of Aliyah. He wanted people to get to the land of Israel. He said the only good place for a Jew to be is in the land of Israel. I have news for you, friends. Once again, that is Torah Judaism. That is pure and simple Torah Judaism. The Jews are a covenant people. The Jews are a covenant people who were given a covenant land and a covenant law. And it is absolutely incumbent on those who believe in that covenant, who believe they are that covenant people, to be keeping that covenant, not meaning that they're keeping the law for salvation or things like that, right? But meaning bare minimum, that they are utilizing the blessings which God has given them, including but not limited to the very land that defines this covenant. The Bible says very clearly you don't give up any land in the land of Israel. Read Deuteronomy. You give up nothing. You give up nothing. Read Judges 1, for example, how the Israelite people were chastised for not taking up all of the land, for conceding to some of the people who originally lived there to allow them to stay in the land. This is pure and simple Torah Judaism, friends. Jews are to be in the land of Israel, not because of some sort of xenophobia, not because we can't live peacefully with them or them with us, but because they are a covenant people with a covenant land. A special unit to deal properly with Jew haters outside of Israel who threaten Jews there will be set up. This is basically the JDL. There will be no sanctuary for murderers of Jews, Israeli or not. A special office to deal with the suffering of Jews outside of Israel will coordinate nonstop protests and pressures throughout the world. And of course, that's important when you consider groups like B'nai Israel and Beta Israel and the Yemenite Jew and others who are persecuted in the areas that are their homes, right? They were born and raised there. Political, cultural, social, and all economic ties to be cut off with Germany and Austria. We will expect the Germans to continue their full obligations to Israel and victims of the German atrocities. The Germans owe us reparations for property, and we owe them nothing. The money does not absolve them from one sin, one crime, or one murder. The humiliation of the United Nations, defamation, and degradation of Israel will be put to an end with Israel's withdrawal, saying that they need to leave the United Nations. I totally agree with that, by the way, and I think the United States should also leave the United Nations. Are you guys, by chance, hearing things that maybe you've heard before in Israeli politics? I think you might be. I think you might be. Is it or is it not a constant Israeli talking point? The United Nations is constantly defaming us. The United Nations is constantly attacking us. Should we withdraw or should we stay? Is it really worth it to be here, right? All this other kind of stuff. Is it not a constant talking point, excuse me, amongst Israelis to have Aliyah taking place? Is it not a constant talking point to have the funding that other countries give to Israel being cut down? Ladies and gentlemen, nobody knows this man's name, but he is the source for almost everything being talked about in Israel. We're going to continue and see so much more of it. Wait until you read this portion we're getting to right now, land and sovereignty. Immediate annexation of every part of Israel that is in our hands. That would be Judea, Samaria, the Gaza Strip, and Golan Heights. And unlimited settlement for Jews everywhere in that area. Those of you who are watchdog watchers know that this is the issue in Israel. The major issue in Israel is settlement of the so-called West Bank, properly known as Judea and Samaria. Once again, where does that come from? Where does this idea come from that, no, we're not interested in a two-state solution. We're interested in pushing you out and taking this land for ourselves, right? It comes from Kahane. Nobody's going to give him the credit for it, but it comes from Kahane. Sovereignty from the Temple Mount shall be taken from the Muslims and given to the rabbinate. Jews will have unlimited access to those areas of the Temple Mount that are permitted entry by halakha, and a synagogue will be built there immediately. One thing I have to say I always respected about Kahane is that he did not want to rebuild a temple, but rather wanted to build a synagogue, knowing that Messiah himself should be the one to build that temple. I greatly respect that. But, again, is this not one of the major issues in the land of Israel? Temple Mount rights. Yehuda Glick, another American-born rabbi, who, by the way, is a Kahanist, constantly, every single holiday of every single year, ascending up to the Temple Mount with Jews to pray up there at the Temple Mount, to protest the fact that the Muslims don't allow Jews to actually pray there by status quo. Where does that come from? It comes from Kahane. It comes from Kahane. Every young couple will be offered a dunam of free land to build a home with minimum mortgage. This will encourage young couples to leave the cities, and also to live in an environment of air and land rather than cramped into tiny apartments, high-rise buildings. Military. The army shall be given a free hand to shoot when it feels necessary at any attacker, including stone throwers. Let me ask you a question. Is the issue of stone throwers and whether or not you use deadly force against them and whether or not the the Israeli government is being hampered by foreign powers, is that not one of the large issues being discussed in Israel today? Who brought the issue up? It was Kahane. It was Kahane. Isn't it amazing how so many things can be influenced from a single man, can get their source from a single man, that none of us even know of, How often history operates this way. Every soldier during his 3 years of basic army service will learn a manual trade and will be given an opportunity while in the army to spend much of his last year at home working in that trade. All women will be exempt from army service, but will be compelled to do national service in their neighborhoods and come home every night. A separate large army base shall be set up in which Haredi Jews will do their army service. Once again, those who know Israeli politics will know that the ultra-Orthodox community's unwillingness to participate in acts of the state, including but not limited to being a member of the military, is one of the largest issues in Israeli politics. Who brings it up? Who decides this is an issue? Who decides we need to start talking about it? Once again, it is Kahane. All Israeli politics can be understood through the lens of Kahane. I'm telling you, every single one of them can be understood, or every single political position, every single political dispute can be understood through the lens of Kahane. And understanding this man, I think, totally illuminates your understanding of the Middle East. Any full-time yeshiva student who does absolutely nothing will be exempt. The many thousands of part-time yeshiva students will be doing army service at the special base. Freedom of the press will be strictly enforced, but with obligations. All correspondence and papers will be held to a strict, truthful reporting standard, and no boycott of events will be allowed. Excuse me. Religion. A Jew will be defined only as one who is born to a Jewish mother or converted according to authentic halakha. This is an area where I have serious disagreement with Kahane. Kahane was really amazing in his unwillingness to fight Jews, in his unwillingness to cause civil strife, to the point where when the socialists started attacking, literally, physically, violently, members of the Kahanist party, and well before that in the revolution, members of the Erdogan, Kahane was one to say, turn the other cheek, basically. Don't attack them back. Don't strike them again. Don't return evil for evil, because we are not in the business of fighting fellow Jews. And I've always greatly respected that. But there is unfortunately a little bit of a contradiction in what Kahane thought there, and that was that this did not extend to certain Jews. And to this day, it doesn't. And again, and this is where you see some of the unfortunate examples. Remember, I was talking about earlier, these symbols, both the negative and the positive of these symbols do have legitimateness, if you will. There's a word I'm looking for, right? But you are right in feeling those way, both of those knee-jerk reactions, right? Well, guess what? A lot of the negative that's happening in Israel today is also a result of Kahane. A Jew will be defined only as one born to a Jewish mother or converted according to authentic halakha. Now, don't get me wrong, that is standard Israeli law. But it is people understanding that has caused in the modern century persecution of Karaites, persecution of Messianics. Very often, persecution of Karaites and Messianics is happening at the hands of Kahanists. Look up Meir Ettinger, for example. Meir Ettinger is the grandson of Meir Kahane, a Kahanist through and through. And yet, what is his most recent claim to fame? Firebombing a couple of, I believe it may have been Palestinians, but I believe it was Messianic Jews. So we see here that even the negative that we see in Israel, the persecution that seems to be rising against the Karaite and Messianic Jew, even that comes from Kahane. Non-Orthodox temples and rabbis will be allowed freedom to practice in Israel, but worse, the use of the word Rav, meaning rabbi, will not be allowed. The actual word rabbi, I don't know why he's okay with rabbi and not Rav, but maybe there's a reason for that I'm just not familiar with. Because he does say rabbi may be used, and no such place may be used with the words Beit Knesset, which is the Hebrew way of saying a synagogue. But he does say temple or center may be used. Reorganization of the religious courts will take place to ensure the choice of dayanim, or judges, on merit, and to insist that procedures for divorcees be streamlined and hurried. People of other faiths will be given total freedom to pray and worship and observe as they see fit, but never, ever to proselytize. Here we see another one of the negatives in Israel that comes directly from the ideology of Kahanism. Those of you who are aware of Israeli politics will be fully aware that there is a radical Jewish fundamentalist group in Israel that hates the Christian faith. That hates the Jews who would have the audacity to declare themselves Christians. Dr. Michael Brown was recently in Jerusalem not 2 years ago. And going there, he had such lovely and welcoming sentences said to him by his fellow Jews as, "I'll pour hot steel down your throat and I spit at your feet." And that comes from Kahane also. Why? Never, ever are people to proselytize. You can observe in your home and even in your place of worship, which, to be fair, makes Kahane a little bit more of a ethical man than some of his followers, who would say that you remove Christianity out entirely, right? But you're not allowed to go out there and witness to God's own people. You believe you follow the Jewish Messiah, well, guess what? Keep it to yourself. It's a very negative thing. Very negative thing. And he would go farther than this very often. He would go out of his way to suggest that missionaries who were Jewish, right? In other words, Messianic Jews, were not in fact Messianic Jews, were not in fact missionaries of the Christian religion who were Jewish, but rather were infiltrators with the goal of destroying the Jewish people in the land of Israel. And it's always been something that has been heavy on my heart personally, because I have so much admiration for Kahane, for so much that he did, and for how he tried to force, not force in the sense that he's actually putting a gun to your head, but tried to force in the sense that he won't shut up about it. People to acknowledge Torah Judaism in Israel. And yet, at the same time, that doesn't extend to the Messianic, to the Karaite fellow Jews, and of course my fellow Christians in one of those instances. I myself, like I said, am descendant of Jews. I don't know whether or not I would actually be eligible for return under the law of return. I suspect not. I think I'm far enough removed from my Jewish heritage that would not be the case. But if it was the case, that would be me. That'd be me. Somebody who admires Kahane very deeply, who he just says, nope, you don't have the liberties. You don't have the liberties. Even the negative that we see in modern Israel comes from this man and his ideology. Next, we see intermarriage between Jews and Gentiles will be forbidden by law. Respect for the Gentile will be demanded, but that will not include sharing his or her bed. Once again, that is standard Torah Judaism. Of course, we are all very familiar of the story of Samson and of the story of Solomon, and how it was the falling into lust with foreign women that caused them to commit so many acts of egregious sin. So, you guys can see a lot of the negative aspects of ideology here. You guys can see also a lot of positive aspects of the ideology here. How is a Christian to look at this sort of thing? How is a Christian to look at a Jewish man being properly Jewish? How is a Christian man to look at a Jewish man who says, without hesitation and without reservation, I am a Jew. I am a chosen man of God. Not because I'm special, but because he chose me. What do we do with that? What do we do with the Jewish man who says, it's my Temple Mount, my holiest site. You have no right to it, Muslim. What do we do with a Jewish man who says, it's my land? My ancestors were here, not yours. Who says, look, we're not going to intermarry because that's what my Torah says. How does a Christian condemn this man? You don't. You can't. You can't possibly, because he's following the scriptures. And yet at the same time, his abject hatred of Mashiach clearly manifests in the form of terrorism against Messianics and Karaites from his own followers, from his own grandson. So how are we to deal with this sort of thing? I said I'd explain some about the symbols towards the end of this. Why do I own these articles of clothing in the first place? Well, I own this because I'm very, very proud of the fact that I am a descendant of Jewish people. I'm a very firm supporter of the nation of Israel. I'm a Zionist through and through. I love my people, right? And I love my people not just in the sense that I love Jews, but also I'm a descendant of Scots, and I'm very interested in the Scottish heritage, right? And I'm a descendant of some Germans, and I'm very interested in German heritage, right? These are, as far as I'm concerned, though Americans are like my nation, these are my people just as well, and I love it. I love being descendant from these people. I have a very strong bond with my ancestors, I think. in the way that obviously, not in like a spiritual way, right? I'm not praying to them or anything, but in the sense that like I take this sort of thing very seriously, right? Why do I own this? Well, same thing. I'm a descendant of Southerners. There's a lot of pride that Southerners take in being a unique group of Americans, right? In being a religious group of Americans, a conservative group of Americans, a group of Americans with a culture unique unto themselves. I also am one who wishes to see history preserved, and I hate how we live in a society where the simple symbol of something can be so offensive that we whitewash entire histories. That being said, you guys can now clearly see they're totally non-racist reasons for me to want to don these. They're combinations of heritage and my beliefs and ideology. They mean nothing as far as towards any black person. Black people very often will wear the same shirt that I am. They mean nothing in regards to any non-Jewish person. A lot of Gentiles will wear the same hat that I am. Has nothing to do with that. Does that mean I get to ignore what these symbols mean to certain people? Of course not. Of course not. That's ridiculous. This, to some, is a symbol of the denial of Messiah. And to others, it's a symbol of the oppression of the Palestinian people. This is a symbol of slavery to some. To others, it's a symbol of abject racism and white supremacy. Do I get to ignore that? No. Do you get to tell me what I mean? No. So then what do we do about this? What are we to do about Kahane or these symbols? The answer to that question is, friends, I don't know. I don't know. I built all this episode up for you guys, and I don't have an answer for you. And I don't really know what else to say besides that. We live in a black and white world that is populated by a gray species and gray events and gray ideologies and gray nations and lineages and ancestries. And you cannot take anything simply on your perspective, simply on your potentially white, meaning as far as good, evil, right? The black, white, not racially. Potentially white side, that's fine. You could be in the right. You could be in the right. Doesn't matter. That's not how the world works. It is just as true that Meir Kahane was a hero to the Jewish people as it is that Meir Kahane was a terrorist. It is just as true that he was a lover of the Jewish people as it is that he was a hater of the Arab. It is just as true that he was a rabbi keeping Torah Judaism and following the laws of God as he understood them, as it is that he was an abject Christ hater and rejected Mashiach of his own people. And the moral of this episode today, friends, is chew up the meat, spit out the bones. Understand the good in things while disregarding the negative. Don't throw out the baby with the bathwater, as the old saying says, but rather drain the bathwater and put in some new clean bathwater. Baby needs to be bathed, after all. Approach these issues with a level of sincerity and approach to truth, because they will never be solved with idealism, with black and white thinking. It's simply not how it works. Kahane is a hero to me. Kahane is a hero to me. And Kahane likely would have spit in my face. And both of those things are true. There's nothing I can do about that. That's simply the reality of how things work. And consider that so many other times when you look through so many other things. I also consider Russell Means to be a hero of mine. Russell Means was also a terrorist. He went to the Wounded Knee battle site memorial and took it over with firearms and threatened people who had the audacity to try and take it from him. But he was a hero for Native American rights, and that's a fact. Malcolm X was a Muslim, was a racist, hated people who looked like me. Wasn't a fan of Jews either, by the way, so he hated people with my blood as well. Does that mean I get to disregard that he's a hero to the black people? Of course not. Of course not. He is a hero to the African American people. He fought for their rights when nobody else would, in a way nobody else would. I can't disregard that. Nor can the black person disregard to me how I feel about his racist sentiments. Do you guys see why this is such an important question to ask? Is Abraham Lincoln the hero who freed the slaves, the African American people, who kept the Union united? Or is he the tyrant who owned a concentration camp that had 30,000 people killed in it? Is he the tyrant who executed 37 people in a single day, all of which were Native American leaders fighting for their own homes? Is he the tyrant who suspended habeas corpus, which means your right to trial by jury, who suspended posse comitatus, meaning your right to have the police and the military separated? Which is he? He's both. That's who he is. Is Richard Nixon the man who ended the Vietnam War, who established the EPA, who saved the Jewish people in 1973 in the Yom Kippur War? Or is he the vile, disgusting, anti-Semitic racist who would go out of his way to spy on his political opponents, who would lie through his teeth to his own mother for a dollar bill? The answer is both. And that is the message, I think, of this episode, of this symbol, Mar Kahane. You cannot afford to understand things simplistically. The scripture tells us we are to be wise as serpents, though also gentle as doves. Not or gentle as doves, and gentle as doves. Meaning you will also have to be wise as serpents. And Paul himself got information, got revelation, which is in our scriptures, from those who you may not approve of, like Stoic poets, like Cretan poets, like the Book of Enoch, for example, Gamaliel, for example. Ladies and gentlemen, the world is black and white, but we are a gray species. And it is true that certain folk are certain ways, that whatever way you happen to feel. But the way that your opponent feels, it's probably true also. It's probably true also. And so I'll end this video with saying, if you see somebody who says Abraham Lincoln was a tyrant, if you see somebody with a Che Guevara shirt on, if you see somebody who says I support Bernie Sanders or I support Ted Cruz, if you see somebody who wears a Confederate flag or an African pride flag or something along those lines, you do not have the right to be simplistic about that, because that's not the way the world works. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I hope this was illuminating to you guys. Obviously, I asked a question and I didn't actually answer it, but partially that's because I want you guys to answer it. So what do you think about Rav Kahane? What do you think of these symbols? What do you think of this notion that we as Christians need to eat the meat, chew out those bones, need to be supporters of Israel while also recognizing that they are in fact deniers of Mashiach? What do you think of those things? Questions, comments, criticisms, concerns in the comment section down below. Please remember to like and share this video if you enjoyed the content. If you guys appreciate content like this, please consider subscribing. Hit that bell to get notified of every time we go live. By the way, friends, I do a political channel called the Synagogue News. I'm going to be setting up a separate Patreon for it so that my Patreon for this channel and my Patreon for that channel are different. If you guys want a full-on explanation, a biography of Mar Kahane, and a full hour talking about his ideology, I will be posting those to the Patreon account for the Synagogue News within the month of December. I don't know when exactly because I don't have the Patreon set up yet, and I also want to make sure all T's are crossed and I's dotted when we do this. But if you're interested in the full-on deep dive into this political ideology, into this man, we're going to do that on the other channel, and it is going to be something that is specifically for Patreon supporters, or at least at the beginning, right? And we're going to start doing that a lot, by the way. We're going to start going through different individuals and ideologies and going into the deep dive, explaining how these different things have impacted our world, how they impact world history, what we feel about them, and so on and so forth. So if you're interested in that kind of thing, definitely be interested there. Like and share this video if you liked it. Like and share this video if you liked it. Questions, comments, criticisms, concerns in the comments section below. If you have a problem with my support of Kahanism, or if you have a problem with my donning of these offensive symbols, say so. Please, absolutely. The point of making this video is to have this conversation. If you, on the other hand, see the logic in what I have been saying today, if you see the wisdom in what I have been saying today, please also say so. Once again, we want to make sure we're getting this conversation started. I love you, friends, in the Lord, every single one of you. Jewish, Gentile, black, white, don't matter. Every single one of you are my brothers in Christ, or at least brothers in humanity. Remember that. Remember that if the Lord tarries and wills, you have an obligation to serve him. And with that, we're going to go ahead and get out of here today.